So today we're going to talk about wigs and hair pieces, and this lecture is going to kind of serve as an intro to wigs in general. We're going to talk about the different kinds of wigs and different kind of hair pieces that there are. We're going to talk about wig prep, wig application, wig care, and wig removal. So we're not going to get like into styling or like wig making or anything in this one. This is just going to sort of be like your basics if you're just getting into it. I'm talking about wigs more in like a theatrical sense than I am or like a performance sense than I am for like everyday use, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this, they could definitely apply to everyday life. There might just be certain parts where it's not necessarily something that you would run into in your everyday life for wearing wigs, but certainly the way we care for wigs in theater is very, very similar to the way that you would care for your wigs in real life too. So probably like the very first, like most basic thing, what the difference would be between like a wig and a hairpiece. So a wig is going to be something that's going to like completely cover a performer's hair, and that would give you the easiest way to kind of completely change their hair by color, texture, whatever it might be, without having to do any like actual damage to their hair. So a lot of times people will say that they're willing to cut or dye their hair for shows, but there's going to be certain times when what needs to be done is just a little bit too extreme, or someone might have to completely like change hairstyles or hair colors throughout the run of a show. So it's much easier to not style somebody's natural hair, and it's a lot less damaging to their own hair. Like if I need to make somebody bleach blonde, it's going to be a lot easier for me to just go buy a bleach blonde wig than it is to make somebody sit through having to get their hair bleached and then having to get their hair touched up, and just all the things that kind of go along with like these really extreme hair transformations. So wigs can definitely be your best friend in situations like that. And then hair pieces are going to be usually a little bit smaller than what a full wig would be, so they're not necessarily going to completely change somebody's hair color or hair texture. They're just going to be small additions to that. So sometimes these are decorative, sometimes they add length, they add volume, they can change up color. If you're kind of working in more of like a fantasy wig world, you could be like adding in like feathers or tinsel or something like that. But generally speaking, a hair piece it's just going to be like a smaller addition to somebody's hair, and it's going to allow you to work with the hair that the performer already has without, again, like having to drastically change their own hair. So if you need somebody's hair to just be like a little bit longer, or to be up in a bun or like a ponytail, and they just don't have enough hair for it, rather than having to go out and get a full wig, you could just get something that would attach to their own hair. So if that's more along the lines of what you're trying to do, and it's not necessarily like a fun color like texture addition or like a decorative thing, you really need to make sure that whatever hairpiece you're getting is a really good match in color and texture. And depending on what kind of hairpiece you're doing, it even needs to like blend in lengthwise to the performer's hair. So you need to make sure that you probably have like a little color ring with all the different like hair colors on it, and you swatch their hair if you're going to go shopping for one, just so that you get something that's going to be as close as possible, so that way it mimics their own hair and it still looks realistic on stage. So as far as like the different types of hair pieces that exist, I feel like depending on who you talk to, they're kind of like broken up in different ways. The particular source that like I use to do a lot of like the research and everything for this video listed out a few more than what I feel like I like learned about, that I personally like learned about in school or like in my own work. But again, this is like one way to classify all of them. Everybody kind of has their own way, I think, of like speaking about things, but this will kind of help you at least like begin to get into the world of hair pieces. So we've got 3/4 wigs, falls. Those are the ones, like those two, I think people sometimes make them kind of like interchangeable, but I do have them separated in this lecture and in the PowerPoint that I made for you all too. There are switches, pull-throughs, wiglets, cluster curls, fringes, extensions, and toupees. And what's really cool is like there's some of these things that are probably gonna be like a little bit trickier to find, and they might be more based in like a theatrical world, but a lot of these things, like especially like the extensions, you've got like fake buns and like braids and bangs and just about everything these days, because I do think that like hair pieces and wigs have become like really popular in like our mainstream culture, so it's a lot easier to find these things, and I feel like it may have been a long time ago working in theater, so now you can probably go to just about any like retail or beauty supply store, and you can probably find a lot of these things, so they're not necessarily something that you like always have to make, or that you have to like special order from any kind of a wig place. So the first hairpiece that we're going to talk about is a 3/4 wig. So a 3/4 wig is basically a wig that allows you to use the very front of your performer's hair without having to without having to totally use all of the back of their own hair, if that makes sense. So like if you want a wig to look really natural, if it has a really nice natural hairline, that's always going to look better. But we can't always afford a lace front wig to do that. So if you get a 3/4 wig, what you can do is you would attach it a few inches back, like probably it would be like, I feel like most of them would maybe sit like right here. So you would put it like a few inches back from their actual hairline, and then you would be able to brush their hair over it. So a lot of times if you don't like properly style over it, and you'll see like if you look up like 3/4 wigs online, there's a lot of not like gracefully styled ones. If you don't work on like styling their hair over it, you can certainly see what is wig and what is their natural hair. But if you do a good job of kind of blending the two, you really can't tell most of the time, especially on like on a stage if it's larger. People aren't going to be able to tell that it's not a full wig. So this is a great option just because a lot of times lace front wigs are really expensive, or we just don't have the labor to front every single wig that we would need for stage. So a 3/4 wig is a really good option. And to me, what makes a 3/4 wig different from a fall is that a 3/4 wig can be short or it can be long. But when I think of falls, I always I was taught that a fall, which is our next hairpiece we're going to talk about, is something that adds a lot of like length to the hair. So I feel like a 3/4 wig could be something that's just like a shorter like addition that you're putting on the hair, whereas a fall might be like a really, really long piece that we're adding in. And then there's also a ladder back fall, which is basically just when there's horizontal rows of weft that are sewn to like vertical rows of ribbon, or you'll see, if you also have my PowerPoint, if you're one of my students, that there's like a picture in there where somebody kind of like trimmed down a wig to where it looked like it was like sewn to like vertical rows of ribbon, but it was actually just like the way that they trimmed it down. But basically those are just kind of made in a way that's similar to ladders, so that's why it's called a ladder back fall, and that's a really good way to get a lot of length in a wig. So that's kind of what those are used for, more generally speaking. And then you have switches. So a switch is going to be another really like long hair piece that usually has like a small base or like a loop at one end, and this is usually what like our ponytails or braids are going to be. And then there's also a stem switch, which is a hair piece that's made of weft that is wrapped around a central cord in like a spiral pattern. This helps you create like the illusion of like a longer braid or ponytail than what like the person's like actual hair is. So it just kind of helps you like blend it a little bit more. A stem switch is something that you're definitely probably going to have to make, as opposed to just like maybe finding something that's like made exactly how you need it, a regular switch at the store. But those are definitely things that I think we see all the time. I just don't think that we inherently know them as being called switches. I think we just know that there's like fake braids and fake ponytails, but that is technically what they are called. Another thing that exists is called a pull through. So basically this is an open work hair piece that you can kind of put over like the top of somebody's hair, and it helps to add like a little bit of like thickness, or it can give them like highlights and lowlights if they don't necessarily have it. So you basically would like place it over somebody's head, and it works better definitely I think if somebody has like shorter hair, and you can pull their hair through it because it has like little openings. It's sort of like a grid, and then you pull their hair through it, and then you kind of like comb it all together, and it gives like a nice like kind of like gradual color change. So especially like I think the example that I have photos of, again in the PowerPoint if you're also looking at that, is that there's a man with darker hair, and they add like a little bit of gray to it this way. So it's a good way to do like subtle color changes like that without having to sit there and like gray out somebody's hair or something. And then another thing, so this is a super fun one, is called a wiglet. So a wiglet became, those became more popular in the 60s when people started to wear the beehive hairstyles a lot more. And what they are is they're basically just like a small little like circle of hair that's like mounted on like a round base, and you can use it to like fill in spots that are thinner, or if you're just like adding in volume. Or you just want like a little bit of like extra like curl for decoration, that's kind of where like the little wiglets come in handy. So you see a lot of those mostly in curls, but there are definitely some that are in straighter hairstyles too. And then another kind of curl that's out there, so there's cluster curls. So in today's world, I think of those as sort of those like really, really like curly pieces that people will put into their hair, or if you just needed like a couple of curls on somebody, we might just like take like a straight extension and like curl it, and in theory that would kind of technically become sort of like a cluster curl. But when this became really popular was in the Victorian era. And you can see that like women in that era, they really did their hair up, they really styled it, and a lot of times they would use these hair pieces where curls were attached to a comb or a barrette, and then they would use those to kind of like accent their hair even more and to even give it like a little bit more length. So I don't think we necessarily see it in like the exact same way in our like everyday lives, but certainly if you were doing a Victorian era piece, that is probably something that you could definitely utilize in a wig or in somebody's own hair for a show like that. Fringes, so this might get a little bit confusing because I think sometimes we refer to bangs as fringes, but fringes in the sense that I'm talking about is sort of like it's almost like a toupee, but it's like a partial toupee sort of. So it's basically like a hairpiece that's usually worn over like a bald cap or a shaved head, and it only has hair on like the lower back and the sides, and it usually leaves like the top of the head completely bare. So this is like a very specific look, probably not something that you would run into too often. I've never worked on a show where somebody had one of these. Like I've worked with a few different like toupees, but I have never worked with anything quite in that style, but it is out there, so be aware of that. And then there's just like general hair extensions. So these I think most of us probably know because again, like wigs and extensions have become really, really popular just in I think like mainstream life now. So you can be using these to like add in volume, add in color. They could be adding in texture. There's a million different reasons why you might be getting extensions. Some people get like their hair pretty much like completely done up with extensions, so you can get them like braided in, you can get them glued in, sewn in, you can clip them in. There's a ton of different ways that you do them. If I'm adding them to wigs, sometimes I've put them on like little like snaps and stuff too, just so that way it's not something that's like permanently in the wig. You can just like take it in and out as needed. Or if you ever have like a scene where somebody has to rip their hair out, which I had to do that once for something, you can put little hair extensions on little like sewing snaps, and then that way they can just like pull that out and it's not going to damage the wig in any way. So there's a lot of different reasons that you might be using extensions, but you just have to be careful because if they are not necessarily like put in correctly or like taken out correctly, if they're more like on the professional side of them, you really could damage somebody's hair. So if you're doing more than just like clip-in ones, you want to make sure that you have a professional do that. If you yourself are not necessarily an expert at it, that is not something I recommend trying on your own. I think obviously like putting in like a clip-in one, that's not a big deal, but anything beyond that, you want to make sure that you are sending your performer to somebody that is experienced with that, just so that you don't hurt their hair or like hurt them in any way. And then the last kind of hair piece that we'll talk about are toupees. So I think we're all pretty familiar with toupees are. So that's basically when if somebody is like balding or completely bald, it is kind of like a small wig in a sense that you can put on top of somebody's head to make it look like they have a lot more hair than they might actually have. So to adhere that, you can use toupee tape. Topstick is a pretty popular brand for that, so that's basically like a double stick tape, which I have used for toupees before, like in conjunction with like spirit gum, and it does actually hold up and it works well. So it does what it's supposed to. You can use toupee clips. So I had one person who had like enough hair like on the sides of their head where you're able to clip into it. So that's when you would use a toupee clip, which is going to be like one of these little things. So it's got these little combs, and these little combs have to attach to their hair in order to stay in. So that is one thing that you could use. Usually I feel like it's going to be a combination of like an adhesive. So there's like spirit gum, there's silicone adhesive. If somebody is allergic to spirit gum or they're really heavy sweater, that's when like silicone adhesive might come into play, because a toupee generally, or at least like the ones that I've worked with, because they were like handmade ones, they're all lace, so they're going to be a little bit more fragile. But they're not as, I was pretty intimidated when I first started having to do them, but they're not as bad as they seem. And then the next thing we're going to talk about are just like the different types of wigs that you might run into. So obviously we know that there's going to be like synthetic and human hair ones. So if it's a synthetic wig, that's going to be made from a non-hair material. It's basically, I think of those as like they are basically plastic. So that's why you have to be really careful if you're ever like styling with heat or anything like that, because they will melt. And that is not anything that you want to happen. I've worked on wigs where other people have used heat on them and they were synthetic, and it just like really destroys them, and it takes a lot to kind of get them back to what they're supposed to be looking like. So it's really better if you can just avoid ever doing that so that you don't destroy your wigs and everything that you've been working on for so long. Usually, because we're working on wigs, it takes a long time to do them. Or there's human hair wigs, which are obviously going to be made from human hair. Sometimes there are wigs that are a blend of both. If that's the case, they usually tell you how much heat they can handle, but I get really nervous putting heat on anything. Even like I know there's like synthetic curling irons now, and there's all this synthetic hair that says that you can heat style it. I still get a little bit nervous about that, and I don't necessarily like to put heat on them. I prefer to do like a traditional roller set that way, just because I'm a little bit scared of frying them. So other than having either like synthetic or human hair wigs, you're also going to have hard front and lace front wigs. So a lace front wig is going to be one where like the very front of it, which you can kind of see in this, so this is like a tiny front that I had to put on a wig like really quickly, so it's not a full one, but you can see that all the hair was put in here to kind of make it look more realistic and like someone's actual hairline. So this has the lace on it, and that's going to help blend in to somebody's skin. Whereas if you have a hard front wig is just going to be one where, so this one has bangs, so you can't, and it's going to blind everyone because it's on a white wig block, but it just has like this really ugly edge, so if the bangs were pulled back, that would very obviously look like a wig. So a lot of times that works well if you do have a wig that like has bangs, or if there's going to be something that's like covering the hairline, that would be a good kind of like time to be using something like that. Whereas if there's ever anything where like the hair has to be styled like away from the face and you want to see somebody's hairline, if it's lace front, that's going to look much better. And then even further, like classifying wigs and stuff, you can kind of like really generally look at wigs as like, are there either being like realistic wigs, they're more like period fashion wigs, or they're fantasy wigs. So something is a realistic wig, obviously that's when they're just trying to look like it's somebody's hair. That's probably what we see like the most commonly in theater, but sometimes we also have shows, and a lot of times this is going to be like the 17th and 18th century shows, where we have like these fashion wigs. So that's going to be a lot of like those like white curly wigs, or like those like powdered wigs that we see a lot. So like Marie Antoinette, anything kind of like in that world, the wigs like George Washington, like things like that, like kind of any wig that like people wore them as wigs and everyone knew that they were wigs. They're not trying to hide the fact that they're wigs. They're hard front. They look like wigs. It's cool that they're wigs. That's going to be more of like a fashion wig, where it's like a wig that's worn as fashion during like a specific time period, as opposed to like someone trying to act like it's their hair because everybody knew that it wasn't. And then fantasy wigs are going to be the wigs that are kind of like unnatural hair colors, or they could even be made of like non-hair materials. So there's like tinsel wigs, foam wigs, feather wigs, rope, yarn, fabric. They're pretty much like anything is like fair game if you're doing like a fantasy wig. And so with that, usually you're doing something like that just because it fits into like the worlds of the play better, or it could also be like a safety concern too. So I think there's like a lot of shows out now where like I feel like Rapunzel or like really long hair has become kind of like trendy, but if you have to have somebody like climb this hair or something like that, obviously like they can't climb actual hair, it can't be attached to the person's head. So for situations like that, you would need to make sure that whatever you are making the like wig or like the hairpiece out of, it needs to be something that's like sturdy enough to support a person like climbing it or doing whatever that they're doing. So it's not necessarily just because you're like doing a show with fairies in it that you have to have like a fantasy wig or something. It could just also be like a safety concern too. So that's something to always keep in mind, that whatever you're creating is safe for like the space that you're creating it in and for like the action and stuff that has to take place. So as far as like caring for wigs goes, you need to make sure that if you are working with a lace front wig, don't hold it by the lace, like don't carry it around by the lace. Lace gets enough abuse like as it's like used for shows, and like every time you take it on and off the block and somebody wears it, like it still gets a little bit worn every single time. So you want to be really careful with it. You don't want to carry it around like that. You really want to be like supporting a wig from like the inside, like on the like the top of the foundation or like off to the sides. If it's hard front, if you hold it by the front, like the most you might do is like mess up the bangs or something. So that's not as big of a deal, but you want to be really careful with your lace fronts that you're not doing stuff like that. If you are using a lace front and you're going to glue it down, you need to make sure that you clean that adhesive off every single time that you glue it, just because if you let it build up, it's going to get to a point where, like, one, you can see it, because spirit gum a lot of times turns like white when you do use it. So nobody wants to see that on stage. Nobody wants to see like old crusty makeup on lace fronts. And then also it gets really hard to adhere things after a while if there's so much adhesive stuck on it. And if you wait too long, sometimes you can't get it back off. So if you like don't clean your wig for like 3 weeks and then all of a sudden now it doesn't glue down, sometimes if you soak it in enough alcohol, you can get the spirit come off. But I've been in situations with some lace pieces where it's just like you can't do anything about it, and like you might have to like cut that lace off and like attach a new front to it, or just like it's just gonna be like trashed at that point. So you have to think like the amount of time that it takes people to add all that stuff in. Like in the wig that I have, like it doesn't probably look like it because it's small, but like this whole chunk, like I put all of that in. People put all of that in like individual hairs like when you get to a certain point. So think about the amount of time that it took somebody to make that, and it's definitely worth like the extra like 5 to 10 minutes it might take you to clean it, to preserve something that takes that long to create. And then you also want to make sure that you are like putting lace fronts like back on the block. So if you are like about to do a show, you know, you can like unpin it and just like have like 2 little pins like in the top of it. But if it's like hanging out for the weekend or even like overnight or something, it's really good to go back and block it, just so that the lace stays flat and it doesn't get like folded or twisted. So this particular wig is a little bit weird, since it is just like this little mini front, and this was like specifically created for somebody who this wig did not fit, so there's a bunch of elastic and it's kind of weird. So I have it pinned down on the sides and also on the back, but generally with lace fronts, a lot of times you just have to do the lace and then you do the back. But it's a really good idea to always pin your lace down. Again, it's something that is just like worth the extra time. If it's a hard front, a lot of people do just store them with just like the pins in the top, but if you're going to go back and restyle it, you do want to make sure that you have it like pinned here and pinned here on the block, just so that way you're not damaging the wig or damaging the style either. Another thing, so the last time I looked this up, and from the information I could find now, if it is like an equity show, technically equity requires that wigs need to be washed every 14 performances. If you are not equity or you are not working in a union house or something, I still think it's a good idea for you to spray wigs out with like alcohol every time after like the end of a show, just because people are sweating into them, even with like wig caps and like that barrier and everything. People's heads sweat. After a while, it might start to smell a little bit, so it's a good idea to spray a little bit of alcohol in it just to kind of sanitize it. But if you do get to a point where you're trying to restyle it and it's just not working, or it just like smells a little bit too much, it really is time for you to like undo it and wash it. So for some shows, like if it's really long run, they probably have multiple wigs. If it's not, sometimes you can't do that until the very end, and that's why like trying to keep up with it with the alcohol is a really good idea. Not just for like you putting it on people, but also for your actor or actress too. And when you're washing wigs, you can either wash them off the wig block, and with that you would have them in like a tub. And again, you're never holding it by like the lace, but you would just kind of like move it side to side and like put shampoo on it, kind of work that through, rinse it. I always condition my wigs, even if they're synthetic. Technically, they're not gonna like absorb any conditioner, but it still makes them less tangly. Or you can wash them on the block, and to do that, you would need to coat your block in like plastic or put a plastic bag around them. Doing that is better if you have like really, really long wigs, but you just have to be really careful if you are gonna wash it on the block, that you have that block totally covered, because if any of that water gets into it, it can make your wig block like moldy, and that is not anything that anyone wants. And if you are going to do your wig washing on the block, you need to make sure if you're putting it in a wig dryer that you're opening the the bottom of the plastic bag up so that heat can get inside of it. So again, you don't have any like water trapped in there. If you don't have a wig dryer, my preferred way to dry wigs is to unblock them if they're not already unblocked, and I like to lay them out on towels, and I have them laying with like lace side up, so that way the lace isn't getting crushed. It'll take a couple days to have them dry that way, but not everybody has like thousands of dollars to buy wig dryers with, so that is one way that I found that helps them out. If it's human, you can blow dry it. If it's not human, please don't blow dry your wig unless you made yourself like a homemade wig dryer, then you can. And then really important, if you are going to be storing your wigs, you want to make sure that they are dry before you store them again. Because if you put them, and this happened while I was in school, or at least we like heard rumors of it, that somebody put a bunch of the wigs back before they were dry, and they were all like moldy the next time people went to open them. So just know that if something is wet, even if it's like hair and we don't think like that, don't put it in something that's closed, because you're going to really regret it if all of your wigs are moldy the next time that you go to them. And then as far as storing them goes, I like fold them in half like vertically, and then I like kind of tuck them inside themselves, or if it's like a really long wig, I'll like braid it and tuck the ends of it inside the like wig cap foundation. And I keep mine in like plastic bags, and I have like a little drawer. For a while I had like a number system, and I kept up with that, but most places, if they have a lot of wigs, they will number them, just so that way you can kind of have like a running system, so that way you know like, oh, I need a blonde wig. I can have like this little Excel spreadsheet that tells me like numbers 3, 5, and 7 are all blonde. Like, great, like let me go pull those, instead of like digging through all the wigs that you have. As far as wig prep goes, the reason that we have to do that is because we have to really like flatten a performer's hair down. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get a wig onto them, right? So if their hair is just like if I just kind of like threw all this hair up and into like a bun and tried to put a wig over it, it's either like not going to fit right. It's probably going to fall off because I don't have really fine hair. There's nothing for it to like pin into. So we need it there to help the wigs go on smoothly, and also to just kind of keep the wigs on, because we need something to pin into. Pin curls are like a really popular form of wig prep, but you can also like French braid hair, you can wrap hair, you can do like tiny ponytails if somebody has really short hair, or recently I worked with someone who had like a metal allergy, so they couldn't use any kind of pins, so there was like a combination of like French braiding and then also like tiny ponytails, and a lot of like adhesive that was used to keep their wig on, but you might run into situations like that. For short hair, one thing that you can use, so you can either use like these little like athletic headbands, or you can use like athletic wrap, and this can kind of like go around somebody's hair if it's short, and then you can flatten it with like little like pop clips like that, or again, you can use your toupee clips in there, and that can kind of help stay in their hair, and then this gives you something to like anchor your wig into and anchor your pins into. I like to put wig caps over that. Sometimes if people, like if they're overheating, or if there's somebody that's kind of prone to that, I've had people with shorter hair not want to use wig caps. Not the best, because it's not necessarily like the most hygienic thing in the world to not wear a wig cap, but again, you don't want somebody to like overheat on stage. So sometimes I just, especially for like outdoor theater or something, or like summer theater in general, I will just kind of like default to that, just because with the band around it, it's kind of covering up everything already, so it's not the end of the world without a wig cap, but it's still better if they wear it. And then Serger Fix is another thing, which is like, it's like a medical like bandage. It's like a tubular like bandage. A lot of people use that, and with that you basically only need to have like a couple of pin curls, like 5, so five of them really, in the front of your hair, and then you can basically like scoop everything up into the Serger Fix, and that kind of flattens it, as if you had wrapped your hair. I've never personally worked with it, but I've worked at places that use it. So that's a really good option too if you can get your hands on that.